Sometimes you get what you want. That was my immediate reaction to the amazing Shogun finale, which is somewhat strange considering the idea of having to let go of what you want is such a central theme. I was hoping they would focus on how Mariko's sacrifice made a difference. At about the 20-minute mark, two scenes follow each other that show this on a personal level through two characters who were close to her. First, we see Cosmo Jarvis do some of his best work as he's being shuttled out of Osaka. He's just heard from his Catholic nemesis, Ajiro, that his life has been spared because of a deal that Mariko made with the church before her death. He tries to fight the tears as this hits him, but that's a battle he can't win. Then we cut to the heir and his mother Ochiba through a transition that shows him reaching up to touch a drop of water on a leafless tree in their garden. He asks her about the poem and the meaning of the line, "a leafless branch." She explains her friend who just died wrote it and that they need to finish it. He offers his take and then she lands on, "Flowers are only flowers because they fall," which is a line that Mariko told her childhood friend in their goodbye. And Ochiba finishes the poem by adding, "but thankfully the wind." These are two small moments of people dealing with the loss of something they love. And the actors do such great jobs of conveying that they'd work even if that's the only reason they were there. Blackthorne's marks the beginning of his change, but Ochiba's is a decisive moment for Japan's history in the show, which we won't understand until much later. What I love about this choice and this show overall is that even if you never interrogate what her words mean to understand what she's thinking here and how that shapes her decisions, the ending still works. Poetry is not for everyone, and the writers seem to know that. Even if you never connect the dots of her using the word wind, and Toranaga saying later that he doesn't control the wind, he only studies it, you'll probably still enjoy watching the way Fumi Nakado plays it and connect to her sense of loss in that last shot of two very powerful people thinking about those words. Having read James Clavell's book, I knew going in that there was a 99% chance that we'd never see the Battle of Sekigahara in the finale. If you were disappointed with this, I won't say you missed the point, but I will say that we probably just like different kinds of TV. And if it makes you feel better, a lot of people didn't like the ending of the book because it played out in a very similar way. It's a large book, probably the largest one I'd tackled at that point in my life, and I won't say that as I started to notice that there weren't very many pages on the unread side of the crease that I didn't start to wonder how they could possibly show Toranaga's rise to Shogun in what was left. It is called Shogun. That creates an expectation. And for that reason, the end was a surprise, one I had to think about and let set in. But once I'd done that, I found myself agreeing with the choice to do it that way. Still, it's a hard ending to pull off in a book, and even more so in the television format. In the book, we just get all the information through Toranaga's thoughts, which is something you can't do on TV. And when I saw those shots of the battlefield in one of the trailers, I thought they'd go the route of showing the beginning of that and then pull away to a description of what happened printed on the screen. Using the conversation with Yabu was a much better choice, and one that required a lot of setup that you can look back and see knowing how it all came together. That also opens the door to using Blackthorne and Yabushige's journeys to parallel each other. Yabu's inability to make the change he needed to until it was too late gives the Anjin's ending and the change that he experienced more weight. So maybe if you weren't sure how you felt about episode 10, take a step back and think about it, because in my opinion, this is a great example of what TV storytelling can be. Even the choice to start with a flash forward to old age and a life in England that would never happen. I wasn't sure how I felt about this at all when it was first introduced. But when you get to the point where they show their hand and understand that this isn't an old man dreaming about his time in Japan, but it's Blackthorne's dream, the one that he has for the future, and realize this is what he needs to let go of to become a different person, then it all starts to make sense. Then you get that satisfying feeling because the show asked you to pay attention and rewarded you for your effort. And there are just so many things like that in this 10-episode limited series, which I didn't want to end, but still feels like a complete story that I don't even know how you'd be able to add to. We know from history that Toranaga will go on to become Shogun, even if he won't throw a bone at the dying Yabushige and confirm it in his final moments. Japan will be unified under his rule, and the Warring States period will come to an end, and we witnessed the cost of that. More importantly, we got to witness how the characters we've invested so much time in changed. Or because this is a story about human beings, how they didn't. One of my favorite details they use to highlight this, which also concerns one of my favorite changes from the book, is how they connected Fuji's first and last scenes. Japan's #1 consort, who we know now will be its best nun, was introduced when Mariko went to talk her down after she learned that her husband and infant son were going to die. She was able to get through to her, and when the samurai comes to take her baby, Mariko stops him saying, "Let her hands be the last to hold her son." In her final scene, when John is about to drop Mariko's cross in the water, and subsequently confirm that the dream sequence isn't a look into the future that will happen, she stops him for a second and says, "Let your hands be the last that hold her." This is more than just a cool callback to a line you might remember. It's coming from a person who was determined to die and is now deciding to live. It's a good ending for a character who added so much to the story through the similarities her situation had with Mariko's. In the book, she never changes her mind, and Toranaga eventually makes a secret deal with her that she can kill herself on a trip and make it look like an accident so no one will know, and that's the last we hear of her. So change can be good, it's important in a story, and hers makes sense based on the one the show told us. To recap what happened in the finale, it opens with what looks like a much older Blackthorne near the end of his life holding on to Mariko's cross. It takes a moment to get oriented, but through the conversation his very white grandkids are having, you realize that he returned to England. From that we cut to Yabu trying to wake him up directly after the explosion that ended the last episode. I don't know why, but I wasn't expecting to revisit this moment or see Mariko's body. But we do get to see his emotional reaction and that he does his best to give her last rites in the chaos. This stood out to me because that's something I would associate with Catholicism, and reminded me of the scene in episode 2 where the priest was trying to convince Kiyama that the Taiko needed to receive the sacraments before he died, and Ochiba shut him down. This is a small detail, but since he's a Protestant and very anti-Catholic, this is a way to show that instead of thinking of himself, he's thinking about what she would want. He touches on this a few days later after waking up from being asleep for a long time after the explosion, and is being escorted out of town by Alvido. When he describes the incident, he says, "I spoke before God. Not your God or my God, just God." They also talk about Toranaga's fate, which Alvido believes to be sealed now that Ishido has the Council of Regents mobilized for war. Blackthorne doesn't believe it. After all, Toranaga got exactly what he wanted. The hostages are free, and all without a war, no dirty hands, just a woman. He does believe he's being taken to his death though, which based on the badass looking guy that Kiyama sent to escort him and his walk through the forest in episode 3, makes sense. Really, when you think about it, quite a few walks through the forest ended badly in this series. But as I already mentioned, he'll make it out of this forest alive because of the deal Mariko made. Ishido finds himself doing damage control after the botched kidnapping. He learns that after he heard about Mariko's death, Toranaga secretly fled Edo and is now preparing for war rather than surrender. You can see a division between the regents, but sense that it's still in their best interest to stop Toranaga. With support from the heir through Ochiba, they can still claim to be on the lawful side of things, which is important. Mariko's death is having an effect here though, especially with the Christian regents who insist on giving her a proper burial, which Ochiba stands up for when Ishido tries to play it off. He even brings up her disgraced family line, which hints that he hasn't gotten over her pointing out his peasant roots. At least he's got his guy Yabu, right? When he goes to see him to tell him he'll be rewarded with his council spot, he sees that he's taking it worse than anyone, as he tries to catch catfish in his pond that aren't there. I wasn't sure what was going on here, but after looking into it, the story he tells about the earthquake stopping the Taiko from going to war with Toranaga is based on an event that happened in real life. It's one of those moments where if the earthquake hadn't happened, or there wasn't such a reverence for natural phenomena, then the Tokugawa shogunate may never have become a reality. The historical figure the Taiko is based on believed that the earthquake was caused by a catfish, and later even ordered that Fushimi Castle be built so that it would be protected from catfish as a result. Yabushige seems to be suffering from delusions, and even Blackthorne has to tell him to pull himself together at one point when he tries to strip down so that the engine can teach him how to dive like he did for Toranaga at the end of episode 3. He tries to tell him that he wants to leave on a ship and go to England, and their inability to communicate is another reminder of what the loss of Mariko means. This comes further into focus when they see that the Erasmus has been destroyed. Without his translator, Blackthorne has no one that he can really talk to. Another surprise is when they reach the shore and Yabu is taken into custody by a group of soldiers. It's not a surprise that he's been caught for his treachery, but he's surprised that Omi is leading the soldiers that are carrying out Toranaga's orders. Blackthorne talks to Miraji, who tells him that they think the Christians destroyed his ship. And from that, he starts to put it together that Mariko traded his life for the Erasmus, because without it, he wouldn't be a threat to the black ship that is so important for their trade monopoly. As he's being led through the village, he notices that Toranaga samurai are searching for conspirators, and Miraji says that they won't rest until they discover who aided the Christians in their attack. They walk by a display of severed heads and see the guards roughing up villagers everywhere. Yabu is brought in front of Toranaga in the same place Blackthorne was brought in front of him when he first arrived in Ajiro in the first episode. He's accused of allowing the shinobi into his quarters to stage their attack in Osaka, and Yabu doesn't bother to deny it. Toranaga strips him of his lands and orders him to commit seppuku by sunset tomorrow. Yabu, who we know is obsessed with death and a man's final moments from the boiling scene and his ranking of Nagakados, begs to be given a good one like being torn apart by cannons or being eaten alive by a school of angry fish. While Toranaga likes his imagination, he refuses the request. He also refuses to let Blackthorne be his second, but agrees to do it himself. There's a brief reunion with Fuji where he manages a little Japanese to tell her she looks healthy and strong, and then they share a sad moment where they both look over to the empty space where Mariko used to sit when they were all there together. Toranaga is reunited with his consorts and meets his new son. Kiri brings up Nagakado, who they're still mourning, and Toranaga echoes what Ishido said about him having more sons, which hits quite differently when he says it. Kiri delivers a letter from Ochiba, and Toranaga gets confirmation that Mariko's death wasn't pointless. But we don't know what the letter says until later whenever he's talking to Yabu. For now, he recites some words that Kiri points out are too beautiful to have come from him. He said, "If I could use words, like scattering flowers and falling leaves, what a bonfire my poems would make." Only her words remain, but he says what a bonfire she made as he thinks about her impact on the future. This connects back to what I was saying in my last video about how words were the only tool she had in most of the story, her only weapon. Ochiba's letter and her decision to drop her support for Ishido is a direct result of the earlier scene that I've already talked about where she finished the poem with the heir. The second line was inspired by the real-life person on whom Mariko was based. It came from her death poem that read, "Only if they know when to fall off and perish, the flowers in the world become flowers, and humans become humans." She wrote that before committing suicide, so that she wouldn't be taken hostage by the real-world person Ishido is based on. An act that led to the same kinds of problems that would eventually see him lose his bid for power. In the show, Mariko is writing from the same place, a place of knowing that she'll have to die. And so in the process of two people composing the poem together, Ochiba can give her death and by extension her life the purpose she spent the story searching for. It's a terrific subtle twist for her ending. At home, Blackthorne learns that Fuji can't bring herself to take the remains of her husband and son to the family burial temple. And then, maybe more immediately important, that she'll be leaving Ajiro the next day. Toranaga has granted her permission to become a nun, which is great. It means that she's not going to die, but it would also leave the engine completely alone. For this reason, he tries to stop her. He even tries to order her as his consort, but she explains that her service to Lord Toranaga is complete. He eventually comes around, and when she tells him that she's sad about how the villagers are being punished after what happened to his ship, he requests that she set a meeting for him with Toranaga. The next day, after some quiet reflection in his garden that makes you think about the gardener Yuajiro and the connection they had and the sacrifice he made because of the unfortunate pheasant incident, you realize he's come a long way since then. And when he goes in front of his lord, he has a plan. He wants him to show mercy to the village because he knows Mariko made the deal to let the Jesuits burn his ship in exchange for his life. This is set up well with Miraji revealing his true identity as a samurai and spy, and Blackthorne attempting to deliver his request directly to Toranaga in Japanese. When he can't think of a word, Miraji asks him if he's trying to say hope or faith. And he has a great response saying that at this point either would do. And when Toranaga questions why he doesn't want to wage war against his enemies, he replies simply that he doesn't need it anymore. What really stands out about this scene is that none of this really adds up to a truly changed man. He's changed, but it's still hard to take his word for it, and it's not enough for Toranaga, who refuses his request. To this, Blackthorne says he's the one who's been disloyal and demands to take his own life. And this is where it really gets interesting for a couple of reasons. This is based on something they left out much earlier in the story, and I think that proves to be a good decision. Because I believe the Anjin came here planning to do this, but as it's playing out, I think he realizes he's not sure he can go through with it. It was his plan, but we see how his beliefs are still fluid as this is playing out. If this happened earlier in the show, it would have almost felt like a performance, because I don't think he was at a place where he could have followed through on such a sacrifice. To reinforce that, he reveals his true intentions. He came to Japan to use them, and did what he had to do to try to make that a reality. Even here, it's not until he thinks about the dream he's been holding on to, and then looks down to see Mariko's cross in his hand, that he says fuck it, before repeating her phrase, "We live and we die." When he lets go of the dream, he can do something genuinely selfless. And after making a declaration of protest, he attempts to slit his own belly. Toranaga intervenes to make sure he can't finish the job, and says if you're finally done, rebuild the ship and make me a fleet. Which sounds like something that could give this empty new life he finds himself in some purpose. There is a lot of responsibility if you want to be Shogun, and as the Taiko told Toranaga in the flashback in episode 2, the man who stands at the greatest heights is the loneliest man in the realm. His next appointment touches on both of these issues. After stopping the Anjin suicide attempt, Toranaga has to fulfill his duty as Yabushige's second. That's a pretty full day. This presents him with an opportunity to reveal his hidden heart. And if you think about it, all the people he's revealed himself to this season, Nagakado, Hiramatsu, Mariko, they're all dead at this point. This is the only person left he could reveal his plans to, and it only works because he won't be able to betray him after he's dead. His impending death has snapped Yabu out of his delusional state, and on his way to his end, he says his goodbyes to Omi, who he says he considers the son he never had, and presents him with his death poem that reads, "My dead body, don't burn it, don't bury it. Just leave it in a field, and with it, fill the belly of some hungry dog." Tadanobu Asano has delivered one of the most memorable performances in a series that is full of them. And I love the look on his face when he said, "Impressive, right? I think my skills have never been sharper." And I also appreciated Omi's tear to inject some humanity into a show that in some ways has desensitized the audience through a string of impactful deaths. In the book, the death poem he uses here was Gin's, that she revealed to Mariko during a negotiation. And it was adapted from a real death poem that was attributed to Ono no Komachi. But I guess so many poets have been cited as its author that no one knows who the real author is for sure. This is another detail that feels like something they came across when they read the book and knew they wanted to use it. The scene with Gin didn't make it into the show, but I feel like they settled on this being for Yabu early and then added the line about Nagakado's death being better than being eaten by dogs so they could make that connection. As you've come to expect by this point in the story, their final conversation doesn't disappoint. Yabu laments about all the days he'll never see. Toranaga says if only it were that simple. And then he surprises him by revealing that he's the one who burned the Erasmus. He explains Mariko's role with the church and how it was to save his life, but adds that it was also a test. This is where his lord breaks it to him that Crimson Sky already happened. He sent a woman to do what his army never could while the regents were united in Osaka. The sacrifice planted the seeds of division, and from there, things will fall into place. Ochiba won't back Ishido when they meet on the battlefield. That'll be the last bit of division he needs to give him a chance to win. The price he paid was real in the lives that were lost. And I do believe that he's affected by that, but in his lofty position, he convinced himself that he was sacrificing a few to save many. That sounds good, and you'd almost believe the guy we were watching for most of the season. And maybe he believes it himself. But it was all in service of becoming Shogun, and his statement that the battle will turn before it gets started severely minimizes the amount of bloodshed that will still require. He lays out his reasons, saying he'll start with his center of power in Edo, and there will be a nation without wars and an era of great peace. Again, that sounds pretty good. But when he reveals that he mostly keeps Blackthorne around because he makes him laugh and his enemies need a distraction, Yabu sort of speaks for all of us, saying, it's hypocrisy. Our lives, all this death and sacrifice from lesser men just to ensure some victory in our names. To that, Toranaga reminds him of what the engine told him when he insisted that his fight was pointless. Unless I win. Yabu finally can see the bigger picture and calls him out for it. He always wanted to be Shogun, and he's no better than us in his secret heart. He uses his final wish for a confirmation, which he won't get. Why tell the future to a dead man? Yabushige still manages to get a good death when, without hesitation, he plunges his blade into his stomach and looks his lord in the face. And then Toranaga chops off his head with one clean stroke. In an attempt to help Fuji let go of her grief, Blackthorne takes her out on a boat and explains the idea behind a burial at sea. With his encouragement, she spreads their ashes and he lets go of Mariko's cross so that they can both allow themselves to say goodbye. This is where things come together and you understand the purpose of the dream sequence. And seeing these two together kind of makes you wish she'd stick around, but it makes sense for her to leave, and you feel okay with it. She might not have ever gotten over the smell of his rabbit stew, but their adoration for each other is easy to see in their final moments. It doesn't end there, though. That comes when we watch Blackthorne enlist the villagers to help him get started on his new project that might end up lasting the rest of his life. He'll never be at home in Ajiro, but it does look like he's making a home for himself there in this last scene. And he even has a moment with Buntaro, who in their loss share something. He passes him his drink and then walks over to share a look with Toranaga to close out the series. This is such a tricky thing to try to do. No words, no overt expressions, just two men looking in the other's direction. When Blackthorne breaks the silence with a it at least gives the impression that they see each other and each one knows who he is and how they got there. If you win, anything is possible. And as Gin said in episode 7, fate is like a sword, useful only to those who can wield it. The series ends with a shot of Toranaga from behind, looking into the distance, dreaming of the future. So as I said at the beginning, this was a really satisfying ending that pays tribute to the original novel. I was a little surprised that they left what Toranaga said as his final words about Blackthorne. But this is also the guy who is beheading villagers to keep up a story, so on some level, the engine holds a preferred position in his realm. In the book, he added that he also needed a friend, which makes sense as an idea, and there was a relationship between them in real life. But even the first time I read it, I thought that seemed a little bit far-fetched. But either way, I don't think the show ever committed to going in that direction. And from there, you just have to decide what you think. Toranaga is a complicated character, and the show leans into that instead of trying to shape him into something else. And his historical counterpart did end the Civil Wars. History is written by the victors, but it's there to look back on for everyone to see. The isolation we see him experience at the end is real, but then he also welcomed it. And I can't feel too bad for a guy like that. I suppose the point is that there doesn't have to be one. There has been quite a bit of an emphasis on fate, and sometimes individuals find themselves in positions where they can affect change. The shogunate that he created lasted longer than any other in Japanese history. It wasn't all good times and a nation without wars and an era of great peace, but it was those things. Since I've finished the show, I've thought a lot about Yabu seeing his lord for the first time, something that no one ever gets to do. And the contrast with Blackthorne, who is the parallel for his story, who's always been on the outside and able to see things in a way that insiders couldn't. Yabu's is a fleeting glimpse cut short by a couple of well-sharpened blades, and that feels right. And he got to tell him what he thought, which is something no one gets to do, and it was a lot of fun to watch. And as I said the other day in my preview video, Shogun is a book about the differences between Japanese and Western cultures. That's the main thing. It uses this historical period because the two cultures are still largely mysteries to each other, so it can introduce a character like Blackthorne and his outsider's view while we watch him experience an advanced culture that is completely different from his. Both sides think that they're the pinnacle of civilization and that the other one isn't. Then the other layer is that it's also about power. Who gets to wield it, and how people find their place, their position, or their purpose within that system. And at the end of the day, more than I think about that, or I think about Yabu's peek behind the curtain, I think about Mariko. In the actual battle of Sekigahara, her real-life counterpart's death did play a major role in the way things played out. For the TLDR of all the other characters, in real life, Ishido's counterpart lost at Sekigahara even though he had a huge advantage going in. Other lords turned on him and he was eventually beheaded in Kyoto. That was a little kinder than the ending that Clavell gave him in the novel. There, Toranaga captured him, buried him up to his neck, and left him there, inviting passers-by to saw at the most famous neck in the realm with a bamboo saw. He lasted for 3 days. The real heir eventually came of age after the shogunate was already established, and he made a couple of attempts to consolidate power. Buntaro's real-life counterpart, who was an active participant in just about every major battle that put his lord into power, led one of the attacks on Osaka Castle when both the heir and his mother, who Ochiba was based on, died. William Adams, who was the inspiration for Blackthorne's character, became a trusted advisor to the shogun and built 2 ships for him. In the real history, Toranaga's counterpart never burnt their ship, but he did forbid him and his crew from leaving. After they were there for a few years, the crew went their own way and ended up married to locals. One of them received permission to leave, but died in a sea battle with the Portuguese shortly after. Adams made himself useful in trade negotiations and was eventually permitted to leave the country. He traveled to Southeast Asia several times, but never returned home to England. He died in 1620, 4 years after Toranaga's counterpart. And I think that is a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.